I'm sure many people on the call today will know about Living in Our Shoes, but it sets the context for this piece of research. So I'm just going to remind us of why that is the important backdrop to what we're doing. In 2019, the Secretary of State for Defence invited Andrew Syllou MP to undertake a sort of commission to look at the needs of armed forces families at that time and to assess whether the current support offer was meeting those needs and to make recommendations. And Andrew invited me to be his lead advisor, and Gabriella became the research advisor to that project. We, over a number of months, talked to serving men, women, children, and young people all around the country at different bases and places, and within schools as well, to find out what their lived experiences were. And we learned very quickly, of course, that armed forces families, while they're often invisible to society, face a range of challenges which can be quite detrimental to modern family life and relationships. And of course, there wasn't anything particularly new, but we really shined a light on the difficulties and challenges faced by many families in the armed forces. People talked about the pressures being very hard. And the name of the title for our report, Living in Our Shoes, came from the wife of an army serving officer who said, I just wish someone would take time to live in our shoes and really understand what it's like and what we sacrifice. And the bottom quote on here talks about the challenges of moving frequently and the major challenge of separation, of people being away. So we came to the conclusion that there were many cumulative impacts and disadvantages. And those impacts were about how to balance the operational effectiveness and duty-first commitment, which is, of course, number one, with long periods of separation, loneliness, pressures on parenting, moves which disrupt education, careers, friendships, healthcare, and perhaps biggest of all, the inability to plan family activities and create stability at home. And so this difficulty in balancing service demands with family life, despite the tremendous pride people feel in the armed forces, is nevertheless can be quite debilitating. So we made quite a lot of recommendations, 110 in all, but they were themed. And so we themed them in a number of issues and topics. Housing, very important, the place where people call home. Children, the impact of service life, particularly on education. Partner employment because of the challenges and opportunities with moving. Health and being looked after in the community. Leaving the military, and although that wasn't a major part of our study at the time, we still talked to people who were transitioning out. And then just looking at the support that is available, there is much support out there, many charities doing a lot of really good work. And we talked about the duty of care and the moral responsibility to offer what often are just small acts of kindness. And of course, at the time, we looked at the Armed Forces Covenant and how that might be strengthened. Two things that came through very quickly in talking to people of all ranks was about feeling valued. And people who were not in the serving role were saying they take a back seat at home, but they don't expect to receive anything, but they would like a thank you occasionally. And being valued is about being committed. And that seemed to us to be a really important finding to put pressure on. And we also talked about the small acts of kindness when people often feel isolated and unhappy. And of course, people don't often talk about being an armed forces family when they live in communities. It's not something that we see every day on our streets. We don't see people who are serving except on special occasions. And so people just feel often invisible and isolated. Being kind matters. And communicating directly with service families has been something that has been in contention for quite a long time now. So we produced our report in June 2020, and it was extremely well received, both within the military and so on. The Chief of Defence people talked about it, focusing minds and taking forward recommendations. The Armed Forces Families Federations, all three of them, felt that it was useful for the work that they are doing to support families. And the Secretary of State for Defence was very keen when we launched our report to say that he felt that it asked the government to put more effort into understanding the life of the military family. And he did say that the challenge was to get on and deliver as many of the recommendations as possible. And we, as a team, received a personal letter from the Prime Minister at the time, who felt it was an important step in refreshing the Armed Forces family strategy. So the government produced its report in response to our recommendations in March 21. 106 of the 110 were fully or partially accepted. And that meant that it was a way of taking things forward. But perhaps one of the most rewarding impacts we felt as a team were the number of families themselves who actually said thank you for the work that we had done. And so if we look at the influence that the recommendations may have had, then clearly the renewed Armed Forces Family Strategy, the 10-year 2022 to 32 strategy, was picking up quite clearly on the commitments made in the government's response to living in our shoes. And that strategy has provided a vision and structure through which change can be driven primarily through the issues that we had identified in our recommendations. Looking for greater stability in family life, more proactive personal support, importantly, valuing the contribution families make, and taking a family-centered approach to through-life support, not just at the time of transitioning out of the military. And of course, promoting small acts of kindness whenever possible. So why are we going back to living in our shoes? Why now? Because let's face it, a lot of good things have happened in the last 4 years through the family strategy and through the work that many of the third sector military charities and the local authorities have been doing in support of military families. But of course, the context is ever changing. And since 2020 and our publication, the world has seen a COVID pandemic. We have seen wars with Russia invading Ukraine. We have war in the Middle East. We have all faced a cost of living crisis with inflation. There have been concerns about immigration issues and the changing nature of our society. And of course, geopolitical uncertainty has been increasing throughout that time, and is probably now more concerning than ever before. And the Armed Forces Covenant Act in 2021 also took forward strengthening that. And then last year, we had the Haythornthwaite Review, in which family featured on very many occasions in looking at how the armed forces need to move into 2024. And there are continuing concerns, which have been there for a while, about recruitment and retention. Haythornthwaite has described it as a crisis, since the most common reason for leaving is the impact of service life on family life. And despite the recommendation about feeling valued, the surveys show that some 60% of families still say they don't feel sufficiently valued by the armed forces. And so we've seen dissatisfaction with service life increasing. And importantly, as many as 37% in the surveys every year have said that they don't know where to go for welfare support and information, despite there being a great deal of support and information out there. So how do we do something about these concerns and turn them around? And of course, as geopolitical uncertainty increases, military families are going to feel that pressure ever more acutely, and therefore the support we offer is going to be even more important. So the overall aim of going back to living in our shoes and moving forward is not to repeat that. We are not doing that one again. But we are using the findings of that report as a baseline to assess the positive changes that have been made, but also to determine the gaps. And we also want to pick up on the recommendations from Haythornthwaite and from the implementation of the Armed Forces Family Strategy, looking at the ongoing context within which we do that, with the expectation that we will be able to consider how best to support armed forces families in the future with joined up, sympathetic, thought through and refreshed priorities, policies and practices.
So how are we going to do that? Our research approach involves working closely, collaboratively with key stakeholders, such as our MOD contact group and Forces in Mind Trust. And also we will have an established advisory group on which we will call on their expertise as needed. We will take an iterative approach, building on findings from one stage to the next, and we will listen to people within armed forces community at all times. We aim to deliver regular and frequent outputs, such as project briefings, conference presentations, reports, and website updates. And we will aim to be agile to influence decision-making in the shorter and longer term, to shape positive improvements in outcomes, and to enable continuous evaluation on impact. And our research activities are grouped into 2 phases. Phase 1, which started in November and will span until June 2025, focuses on evaluating progress with implementation of Living in Our Shoes recommendations in key areas within the Armed Forces Family Strategy, the 3 single services and the third sector. We will aim to explore the mechanisms that the government has developed to drive change across the families agenda, and specifically looking at the Armed Forces Family Strategy and the Height and Weight Review recommendations. And we will hope to highlight areas of focus and priorities to indicate whether there's a need for greater or perhaps lesser urgency in relation to implementation areas and consider the changes needed in the strategic context. How will we do this? We'll engage a number of methods, and we will start by in-depth policy analysis, which is conducted within a theory of change framework underpinned by a contribution analysis. We will start looking at the policy documents from both government and the third sector. We will supplement this with a research review and knowledge mobilization to understand what advances in research and understanding of armed forces families internationally there has been. And also we will engage with secondary data analysis from the annual surveys and see how we can use this evidence to inform priorities going forward. We will also supplement all these sources of information by new empirical data generated for the project as necessary. A second important strand of our work will be stakeholder involvement, which is designed around a policy Delphi approach, which consists of engaging panels of key stakeholders to gather insights and build consensus on evidence and priorities. And we hope to engage 2 panels, one at high-level key stakeholders and the other with experts from academia, policymakers and practitioners. And we will aim to do all this by the end of June, and we will produce phase 1 report then. Then we will embark in phase 2, starting in July 2025 until the end of the project in March 27. And this phase is very much about looking forward, building on the learning from phase 1. At this stage, we will undertake an in-depth evaluation at the micro level in key topic areas to meet the various needs of armed forces families. And we will collect new and in-depth evidence from serving personnel, families, the Single Services Families Federation and other key support players, and we will do this via survey, interviews or focus groups. We will aim to identify examples of best practice in supporting armed forces families and to understand the actions needed by the government, the 3 single services and the third sector going forward. We will also aim to identify the mechanisms to drive impact, and will maintain stakeholder engagement and armed forces families throughout. Our research takes an iterative process towards consolidating learning to develop recommendations and providing evidence to inform a renewed action plan for the Armed Forces Family Strategy. We will also aim to share key findings and recommendations with the ministers, service chiefs, and key stakeholders in armed forces families, facilitated by the 3 services and Families Federation. We will aim to respond to feedback from above activity in a timely manner and to make proposals for ongoing monitoring and implementation of recommendations. And we will hope to achieve all these by the end of the project and deliver a final report in March 2027. So what's going to happen next after today? So we're in the process of having a dedicated project website, which will enable us to engage directly with the armed forces community and for us to disseminate project briefing report and supporting documents. We will establish our advisory group whose expertise we will call upon as and when needed. And we already started and we will continue to brief and engage key stakeholders. And in terms of research, we will start immediately with reviewing and assessing changes in supporting armed forces families since 2020 across government and the third sector. We'll hope to understand what has worked well and where the gaps are, and also to place this assessment within the current knowledge and up-to-date research.
Throughout this project, we want to work with people here. We have a lot to do. We want it to be fully collaborative, and we want everyone to share in and contribute to this research. It is not about us going away and just reading lots of documents and coming up with our own ideas. We really want to involve the people who understand it best at first hand. And so we look forward very much to working with you over the coming months. Thank you.